So the other night in my Shadows of the Last War Eberron campaign, the party finally got out of what is it, Rose Quarry, and they met back up with Phelan. Phelan is the guy who took them there on his elemental cart. They paid him a lot of money, and he was a contact given to them by their patron. So they had a choice to make. The choice was either go to Whitehearth, which is the reason they were in Rose Quarry, to find a map to Whitehearth, or go back to Rakan Drawl, which is I think I'm saying the name of that place right. It is a city controlled by goblinoids. They've been there before. That's where they met Phelan, but it's a 3.5 day trip west, and they have about 30 miles east they need to go. The party decided they were heading back to the city to stock back up on supplies. So when they get there, they do a little bit of shopping, asking around the town, and ultimately they decide that they didn't want to rehire Phelan. It was a little too expensive for them. So they opted for buying horses, which ended up being about the same price as hiring Phelan, but now they have horses. They just have to feed them. After they bought their horses, stocked up on gear, they headed out towards Whitehearth. Now, Whitehearth is in the Mournlands. The Mournlands is, if you don't know Eberron, a giant country-sized dungeon. So they get to the gray wall of skulls and mist, and they eventually make their way through it without getting lost, because the barbarian had this bright idea. It's like, hey, I'm pretty good with directions. I'm pretty good outdoors. So Brontgar, the barbarian, grabs a stick and he starts dragging it with him so he can see if they're veering off left and right. And rather than wasting 3 hours in the mist, they pulled through it in 20 minutes. After they get through, and I told the party this, they have a map of where they're going. They know how they're going to get there. And not exploration, but hex crawling wasn't the point of this adventure. It's not a survival game. So I told them, I said, listen, you know where you're going. There's some things you're going to see along the way. You can interact with them if you want to. If not, you can keep on going. You can make this trip as exciting or as boring as you would like. You can get as much gear as you can find, or you can let it go and have an easy road of it. I don't normally like to make things that are in straight lines, but because they've spent 3 sessions already trying to get this map, I didn't feel like dragging out the point of getting to where they're going. So basically, the rest of that session was them walking towards, or riding their horses towards, Whitehearth. They came across, and I'm not going to get these in order, but they came across a valley in the road that was full of warforged broken bodies. And after looking at what was down there, counting the number of them, there was dozens and dozens of them, they decided to circumvent this little valley and carry on in a different direction. They came across a farmhouse in the middle of a field. It was collapsed. The barn and the silo were in a little bit better shape, and they decided to look around. One of the walls was missing from the house, and the monk, Filion, was kind of reminiscent about being grown up on a farm, and he saw some motion in the farmhouse. They get a little bit closer, decided it's not worth the risk. They clear out some space in the barn, and they rest for the night. The next morning, they get up and they see a giant cockroach go skittering back into the building. So they kind of figured out what was in there, but they decided it wasn't worth the risk to see what else may be in that building. So they take off leaving, and they come across a stand of trees, and they find massive pile of bodies. Now, in the Mournlands, the people that died when the country was hit with the mourning, those corpses haven't rotted. They haven't decayed. They're just as fresh as they were the day it happened. So they've come across a bunch of bodies that have been sitting there for 4 years, haven't rotted, and they have uniforms and regalia of the people that were fighting 4 years ago. They also come across some Velanar elves and some Talenta halflings who, these aren't people from 4 years ago, and they're also dead on this pile of bodies. And they look around and find that some of the halflings and the elves, they have giant gouges in them. Looks like a huge claw ripped them apart. The party decides to start looting through the bodies, and what is the actual term for it? I think it's called a carcass crab is what the module calls it. Giant crab, spikes on its backs, bodies impaled on said spikes. Doesn't like the party messing with its pile of corpses. proceeds to grab Nova. Nova is the Warforged fighter and starts crushing Nova. I think Nova stayed in this thing's grip for 3 rounds and got out with like 2 hit points. After about 4 rounds of beating on the crab, it eventually they killed it, dropped Nova, and then they loot through the bodies and finally found a cache of magical items because they haven't really looked around a lot in the places they were at because they were running the whole time. So they found a fair amount of items here to help them out. And then they headed off on their way. Now, before they headed out from the crab encounter, they did notice above them a very large bird. And I don't remember if it was at the crab encounter or at the farmhouse, but they noticed a bird at one of those two in the first place. Has been following them, circling way, way up in the sky. They don't know what this bird is. They just know something is following them, and they're not quite sure what to do with it. So when we start back next time, they're going to be arriving at Whitehearth, and they're probably, I don't know if they're going to just barge right in or come up with a plan. I'm not sure what they're going to do with it, but they will be starting back at in Whitehearth, which is a mine, to hopefully locate the schema that they've been hired to find by their patron.